Now we've covered all of the intervals up to and including 1 octave, I thought it'd be a good idea just to have a bit of a practice moving all the way around the keyboard, looking at all kinds of different pairs of notes and calculating the interval between them just as a bit of practice. So if you're still getting used to the idea of intervals and how to work them out and why they might be useful, then hopefully you can follow along with me and see if you can get to the answers before I do. So we'll do 5. Let's do 5 practice intervals and choose the notes basically at random. So we'll start with an easy one that starts on C. We're very used to working on C. Most of the examples had C in there somewhere. And we will look for the interval between C and A. That should be a relatively easy one to start with. Then let's look at the interval between B flat and C. Then let's have a look at the interval between D and A sharp, and the interval between F and B natural, just a B, and the interval between a B and a D sharp. There's a good range of notes there. I've got a few of the accidentals, a few of the black notes in there, and I've got lots of different sized intervals. So C to A, of course, is quite a big space between the two notes, and B to C, B flat to C, a very small space. So we'll cover a few different intervals in terms of their size and whether we're using the white notes or the black notes. The first thing we could do, and we could do that for all of these really, is work out what type of interval, what basic size of interval are we dealing with. And the way we do that, of course, is to count the number of letter names that we've used from the bottom to the top of the interval. So all these intervals are going upwards. Obviously, you could measure intervals from the top note to the bottom note, you'd end up with the same answer, but to make it easy and straightforward, I'm going to just measure from the bottom to the top. So here's our C, and here's our A, and we're going to count up the number of letter names we use from the bottom to the top. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And that gives us the answer that this is going to be some kind of sixth. What about B flat to C? Well, obviously there's only 2 letter names being used there, B and C. In this case, a B flat and a C. So we're going to be dealing with some kind of second. An interesting one here because we are moving from a white note here, a D, to an A sharp here, but still we do exactly the same thing and count the number of letter names being used from the bottom to the top. So in this case, D is 1, E is 2, F is 3, G is 4, and A is 5. Doesn't matter that we're using an A sharp, it's basically exactly the same thing in terms of this counting, and so we're dealing here with some kind of fifth. And let's have a look at this one, F to B. There is F, there is G, there is A, and there is B. So that's 4 notes between the bottom and the top, 4 letter names. So here we're dealing with some kind of fourth. And finally, B to D sharp goes through B, C, and D. So we know we're dealing with some kind of third. Now that can be useful knowledge even on its own before we go and look a bit deeper into which type of intervals we're dealing with. The fact that we know we're working with a third or a fourth or a fifth can be useful just to talk about music to other people and gives an idea of the sort of size of interval that we're dealing with. And certainly if we've got a good idea in our minds of what key we're in, then most of the time, whether it's a major third or a minor third, for example, will probably be taken care of by the scale or the key that we're using. But when we're looking at these intervals, these distances in a kind of abstract sense, it's good to define them a little bit further and say a bit more about whether they're major or minor. So let's have a go at that and say, well, look, here's our C and here's our A, and we know we're dealing with some kind of sixth. Now, the advice I'd give when you're trying to work out whether they are major, minor, augmented, diminished, perfect, we've heard a lot of different names for intervals, is to have a look at whether these pairs of notes exist together in the same major scales, because that normally gives an indication as to whether they're going to be major or perfect. Just to remind you, when we're dealing with fourths and fifths, we talk about a perfect fourth and a perfect fifth. When we're dealing with seconds, thirds, sixths or sevenths, we normally talk about a major second, third, sixth or seventh if the second note of that interval belongs in the major scale of the first note. So let's just show here. So show here that we are dealing, in fact, with a major sixth, because if we have a look here, we're moving from C to A, and of course A does belong in the scale of C major. Let's play a quick C major scale. There's our A, and so that gives us a good indication that here we are dealing with a major sixth. If we've been looking at the interval between C and A flat, this wouldn't be a major sixth anymore. Obviously it would be one semitone smaller, and that's the minor sixth there, and we would find the A flat in a C minor scale. That's a harmonic minor scale there, and we would hear that A flat, and so the interval of the minor sixth is present in the C minor scale where it's not in the major scale. Let's do something similar here, where we're looking at the distance between B flat and C. The question to ask ourselves is, does C exist in a B flat major scale? Let's have a look. Well, we only have to go one step through the scale to realise that it does. B flat sounds like this. This is B flat major. And so the presence of that C there gives us a good indication that we're dealing again with a major second. You'll remember that we said that major second and minor second are actually another way of saying tone and semitone. So when we're dealing with these very small intervals, actually we tend to be dealing in tones and semitones anyway, and they're quite easy to spot. So a major second is the same as a tone, 2 semitones, and a minor second is 1 semitone on its own. It gets a little bit more difficult with this next one because we're dealing with D to A sharp. We've already worked out that we're dealing with some kind of fifth. Now, if this fifth was to be a perfect fifth, we'd expect the second note of the interval to belong to the D major scale. Now let's see if it does. Here's D major. And we'll notice that actually there's no A sharp in this scale. It just shows how important knowing the scales are, and I know lots of students really hate learning scales. They find it very boring and very dull, but actually it unlocks an understanding of lots more ideas in music once we've got the scales easily to hand. So here's our D major scale, and we'll notice that the type of A in this scale is not an A sharp, but actually an A natural. So this suggests that this interval is 1 semitone bigger than a perfect fifth. And if you remember, we talked about the name for such an interval, and that was an augmented fifth. We can try the same thing again here, where we're looking at the distance between F and B. Again, we should try out the major scale and see if we find a B in that scale. The F major scale starts F, G, A, B flat, C. So if it was to be a perfect fourth, we'd be looking at a B flat there, but we don't have that interval, we have a B natural. So in fact, even though we're using a white note to a white note, here it's not a perfect interval, because in the major scale we'd expect to see a B flat, and so F to B flat is a perfect fourth. So again, 1 semitone bigger, it's just gone a little bit bigger, we've augmented it, which makes it an augmented fourth. So that's an augmented fourth, and it's that kind of slightly sinister sounding interval that we've heard before. And to finish off, let's just work out this slightly more pleasant sounding interval between B and D sharp. We've already worked out that we're dealing with some kind of third, and the next question we need to work out is, are we dealing with a major third or a minor third? Well, the answer would be, well, we need to look at the B major scale, and the B major scale has lots of sharps in. In fact, it has all the black notes involved, which means that because there is a D sharp in this scale, and because we're using it in this interval is a major third. If it had been a D natural, of course, we'd be dealing with a minor third, but because this note is in the scale of B major, we're dealing with a major third.